Hey, how's it going, everyone? I hope you're all doing extremely well. It's been a while since I've done a gameplay discussion, and today's topic is one that I've been wanting to discuss for a little while now. That is this new era of the style of games. Really, I call it this disease that's been plaguing our industry for quite some time, and now it's becoming ferocious enough and widespread enough to the point where it's now infecting our beloved franchises here. That is the games as a service style. Now, this concept is nothing necessarily new. We saw really the rise of it towards the beginning of the 8th generation. One of the first games that comes to mind is Destiny. It was an interesting concept at the time. I myself was actually excited to actually try out Destiny when it came out because of just the idea. It was Bungie's new IP after working on Halo for so many years. So I was like, all right, let's see how it is. And over the course of the 8th generation, I played just about all of the, popular looter shooter MMO games as service style of games that I could think of. I played all of the Division games. I've played Anthem. I've played Destiny, as I just mentioned. There was a good number of games that came out during that generation that I did in fact play and gave an open chance to. And that was one thing that, I sort of realized going into this generation with the PlayStation 5 and Series X is that I was not going to do that this time around. What I realized is that, minus the Division 2, I'll say, because that game in particular for me was a great game on top of just it being a games as service game. It was also just a great game that had great gameplay and really cool level design. I actually really enjoyed the single player aspect of the Division 2 more so than any other of those looter shooter games as service style of games that came out during that generation. That one for me was like the one game that I actually did enjoy and did partake in doing the side content for. What I realized is that those games simply aren't for me personally, and that's all right. I myself, I love storytelling. Narrative-based games are sort of my bread and butter. They are the reason I play video games, is for that storytelling aspect, and I really believe that is the purpose of really entertainment in of itself, is that it is about storytelling from the very beginning. It is sort of the point of filmmaking. We look at narratives with books and novels, and even music to a certain degree with lyrics. Games are interesting where they're the next generation really of that experience of storytelling. But like music in a way, a video game can be a video game without it having a narrative or a story to tell. And we've seen that with online multiplayer only games, that have come out, not just recently, but in the past as well. So anyway, let me start off my thoughts about why I'm actually sort of against this practice of games as service and why I'm not a fan of it. I have not seen a very good, solid example of this games as a service design. Again, barring in mind the Division 2 is really the only one where I've just really enjoyed the gameplay of that. But outside of that singular game, the vast majority of them that I've played have always come out in a very rather unpolished state. The content was always very light, and then what happens is you have people who are dedicated to playing the game, and the developers sort of update the game over time. And so the game, 2, 3, 5 years from now even, is drastically different than when it actually came out. I mean, I think a really good example of this is if you actually look at the game No Man's Sky. I should start off by saying No Man's Sky was heavily anticipated prior to it actually releasing. I mean, a lot of people were really looking forward to it. I myself was intrigued by the idea, but for me, it's like I like a general direction of where to go. I don't find it very fun when I'm placed in a world and expected to just figure things out. And I played a lot of sort of smaller, indie games that are kind of taking that element and, really made a game design around that. I kind of think about The Forest whenever I think of that, because The Forest was actually a game that I was really looking forward to, and I played it and I'm like, okay, I'm lost. What am I supposed to do here? And of course, it's a survival-based game where, you're supposed to be sort of expected to sort of figure out things on your own, and that's fine. That's the type of style of game it is. So with that in mind, going into No Man's Sky, when I first saw it, I was like, okay, this looks like an interesting concept that could be fun, but I don't know, we're going to have to wait and see. So when the game came out, it was universally agreed that the game's quality was basically poor. But on top of that, the content wasn't there. There was missing features that were promised on release. You know, a bunch of different things within the actual design. You know, a lot of things that were promised were not delivered. And so what ended up happening is the game got, I mean, completely destroyed by just the media and the actual players alike. I mean, I remember hearing about all the death threats that were being sent to a lot of the developers, and in particular Sean Murray, the director and sort of the PR guy surrounding, you know, this game. You know, I mean, his reputation was completely squandered, and he kind of went into hiding for a little bit. And then a year and a half later, they started with a massive update that basically changed the scope of the game. And this is where I basically jumped into the game myself. And it's interesting because you kind of look back at No Man's Sky now, or you go back to the game right now, and it's got a completely different mindset surrounding it. And what this kind of does is, for me, it sort of reminds me of a topic that I discussed a few years back, which is, do games sort of deserve a second chance? Is it right for us to basically accept when a developer maybe lies about a product or a game is falsely advertised to us, where we are sold something and the quality level is so poor it is nearly unplayable? You know, it's like, is it all right for us to forgive that over time? And on top of that, what does this say about the developer and sort of their practices going forward in the future? Because unfortunately, if we accept an unpolished product at release, and then later on, you know, still give the game a chance or still play the game, you know, moving forward, what's that going to say about all the other games, you know, that are coming out? Is it going to create this stigma that it is okay for developers to barely put in any effort, or to release something that is, you know, in all respects broken and unpolished to the point where it really hinders your overall experience? You can't enjoy the game. You know, what does this say about new upcoming games, and what does this say about our community and what we're willing to accept? You know, this is stuff that we really have to think about, because, you know, the more that we sort of accept things with open arms and turn a blind eye, unfortunately, the business end of the industry, right, these publishers are going to completely take advantage of that. I don't think any of the developers, you know, I mean, if we're thinking kind of logically about the situation, I don't think any of the developers, you know, would be okay releasing their game in sort of an unpolished state. I think a lot of it comes down to deadlines and publishers and sort of the unrealistic pressure they put on developers to sort of get things out as soon as possible. You know, we hear that a lot about crunch and stuff like that, and I've already discussed that in a separate video myself. But this is the problem right now that I feel is with the games as service feature in games. More often than not, the game comes out with really half-assed content. The polish is not there, but because you're promised content later, usually for free, you know, that is updated to you at a later time, you know, people just accept it and sort of move forward. And I feel like that type of behavior, and in particular from us, the acceptance from us, could have, unfortunately, incredibly damaging effects to the industry. And this is one thing that I'm actually very concerned about, because as you guys know, I'm catching up on my games in terms of my backlog. I'm currently playing through Returnal right now, having a blast with it. But as I'm catching up to actually playing games closer to release and getting there, you know, and I'm gonna eventually get to that point where I'm playing games on release again, it is something that is of a concern to me, is whether or not my experience and my opinion on games are gonna change. Because one of the hidden great things of sort of playing games 6 months to a year down the line was that most of the time, all of the issues with the games were completely fixed. And so my experience with some of these games ended up being drastically different than some people who played them on release. I always think of Days Gone in particular. When I played that game, it was like almost, you know, 8 or 9 months after the game released, and all of those performance issues got ironed out. A lot of the issues with controls and sort of bugs here and there got completely ironed out. You know, that was a game that I really ended up loving, even though, you know, a lot of people kind of criticized the quality of the game when it came out. And it's definitely something of a concern to me, is playing games on release again. Okay, am I going to, unfortunately, be relegated to playing these games in a much poorer quality state. And I think that's just the unfortunate reality of really sort of these games coming out, is that they're so massive, right? They're so expansive. The budget is absolutely crazy. There's so many people working on it that the game just becomes a beast in itself, like an actual living thing, right? And it is nearly impossible for people to check every single corner and to make sure that every single area is perfect, and then to actually test every outcome and every type of behavior level to see if bugs can be caused or you can break the game in any particular way. You know, it's always going to come down to something like that. I think what also kind of encouraged me to talk about this is recently we just heard that Assassin's Creed as a series is going to be making some changes. Now, I played all the Assassin's Creed since the very first one, and I remember being in middle school when the first one came out. Everyone was talking about how amazing the graphics are. I'm going to do a reminiscing video on that game at some point, right? But I played every single Assassin's Creed game, with the exception of sort of the mobile spin-offs, the portable game spin-offs, and I think Rogue is one I also missed. Even though I actually bought that game for PC, I ended up not playing it through fully. But in terms of the mainline Assassin's Creed games, I basically played all of them. And prior to Origins, you know, the formula was very much, you know, the same. It was the same across all games. And I really felt like with Origins, they tried to take it into a more RPG route, which, you know, was interesting. But at the same time, I felt like what ended up happening is that we had quality over quantity. And so now Ubisoft had announced that the upcoming Assassin's Creed games are going to actually take on a more games as service approach. And the developers are working on something called Assassin's Creed Infinity, or at least that's the code name for it, where it's a game that encompasses many parts of the series, but is continuous and expansive and almost never ending. My concern talking about this right now is what's going to happen to the storytelling aspect of it. Now, one might argue that in terms of Assassin's Creed, the storytelling has gone way off the rails and is completely whack, and it's not the reason you really play the game. Yeah, we replay that series anymore. I kind of agree with that. At the same time, I was hoping that Ubisoft was going to end up tying things together, but I don't even think they know what they're doing with the narrative. I think in terms of, you know, Assassin's Creed, at least from a story perspective, it really ended with Desmond in Assassin's Creed 3. You know, that was like the definitive story of that they were telling, and it sort of ended there, and they never really did anything to build off of that. You know, and a few months back, I actually played Valhalla. It took me a long time to get through that game, but I will have to, I do have to admit that the story of that game, if you give it a chance, and unfortunately you have to do a lot of just kind of, you know, repetitive and just formulaic stuff in order to actually experience the full narrative. But the full narrative is an actual interesting and unique twist in the story that it was telling for that world. And it does actually affect the modern day setting that they were actually telling in a very interesting and unexpected direction they decided to take it. So this is a concern for me, is when we have, especially this generation, we have, you know, a lot of games coming out, and I don't see this slowing down. In fact, I see much more games as service style games probably coming out because a lot of people want to cash in on that continuous revenue stream. You know, you sell people a product, they buy in with the MSRP for the game, right? That's the buy-in to experience it. But over the course of many years, you start selling them small little things and then some larger expansions, and you introduce some free updates so that they feel like they're still getting something even though they're not spending money, that they're still, you know, dedicated to the actual experience. And what ends up happening is your $60 game now turns into a $200 or $300 game, and the developers now basically, you know, afforded almost 5 games based off of one individual. And they get basically the entire percentage of those microtransactions in that downloadable content, right? Because there's no production cost. It's developing the content, right? And then you place it on the store, which I guess, you know, you can say that the PlayStation Store, the Xbox Store, they take a 30% cut or something from all sales, right? So there is that, but it's much more that you actually end up getting in terms of the revenue than actually selling another, separate physical game or an entity or some new IP. It's a much larger chunk, and it takes so much less time. So from a business standpoint, it makes complete sense in terms of this direction, and why publishers are so focused on trying to sort of create something that's going to generate that revenue stream for themselves. So the bottom line is this. I don't think that every game needs to be made with everyone in mind. I do think that creative freedom is something that should take full point at all times, right? The developer's vision for me is paramount compared to everything else. And if their vision is having a, sandbox style game with continuously expanding upon it through, downloadable content and microtransactions and cosmetic items and stuff like that, then hey, I'm all for, you creating the game that you want to create. Absolutely. It's just that I fear a lot for the implications this may have long term on the industry. And what's going to happen to these franchises that have gone on for many years? Are we still going to get a traditional story-based campaign out of them? Or is this going to go down the road where, everything is more geared towards the social aspect, playing with your friends, and storytelling takes a major back seat, which in my opinion is just a real waste of potential that you can really do with this medium that we all love so much. Let me know what you guys think. Is there any particular games as a service game that you're excited to play? How do you feel about the direction of the Assassin's Creed? And in particular, what do you guys prefer? If Ubisoft sat there and said, you can have your traditional role-playing Assassin's Creed games, or you can have this new games as service sort of multiplayer MMO, whatever they might do. That's the thing. We still don't know what they're going to do with Assassin's Creed, but judging from history and looking at sort of the other games, in particular what Ubisoft has really done, because Ubisoft seems all focused on this type of element in their games. What would you guys prefer in the end? I can see if you're on the younger side that you probably don't mind the games as a service feature that much, because, especially if money is tight, the notion that you can buy something and it's going to give you something new, or it's going to give you some continuous feeling of progression or something that's refreshing, right? The idea that you're buying a product that's going to grow with you for many years can be very appealing, especially if you're young and you don't have the ability to basically purchase any game that you want. I can totally understand that. I just think for myself, it's a little bit concerning for the reasons that I mentioned prior, but interested to see what you guys think. Thank you so much for watching this video, and hope you all have a fantastic day. Thank you.